Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and I'm glad to be joined by Brian Requarth. We were together last year.
Yeah, we're back. We're back again on stage. That's great.
Exactly.
Good to be here with you.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, and let's just delve into our conversation already because we don't have much time and we have a lot to talk.
Sure.
So we know that the unprecedented investment levels of 2021 were sort of a once-in-a-lifetime moment for Latin America, but we're still seeing a lot of money being raised in the region. 2023 was the third best year in the region, and 2024 has started pretty well. We also know that a lot of the caution that investors had was not necessarily because of a lack of money, but because they were pursuing more profitable, more predictable portfolios. So, Brian, I think you're a perfect guest to have here because you have experienced both sides of the counter. You have, as a founder, you raised more than $95 million, and you're also an investor. So let us pick your brain for a bit and tell us anything that founders obsess about and that VCs don't necessarily care that much about, or something that founders are overlooking and they should be covering those bases?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, back in Rio here on stage with you again. And you'd mentioned that, once in a lifetime, hopefully it's once every 10 years we see these. We want more capital to come back to the region. And things aren't as bad as people say. Things have been relatively good so far at the start of the year, so I'm bullish. I think that things that founders really obsess about, when you look at the investment landscape, you look as a fund, and you look at the perspective of a founder, founders really obsess primarily about the economics. So there's two things you need to think about. If you're a founder in the audience, probably your top thing when you're thinking about raising capital is you're like, what's the valuation? And I see founders obsess about this all the time. That's the primary thing people care about. And particularly at the early stages, I would say the valuation is important, but probably less important. And the thing that, as you raise more capital over time, the thing that's neglected oftentimes is control. So valuation is one thing, which is the thing that everyone talks about, but actually control is something that you need to be really thoughtful of. What does the board composition look like? Is there, a board member, and do the investors want to have another board observer? It might feel harmless just to have another person on your board, but 2 or 3 rounds later, you've got 7 investors on your board, and it's you and your co-founder, and that's not the best dynamic for a company. So I think that, other things to think about, liquidation preference. That's something that I would be very watchful of as a founder, and making sure liquidation preference is basically on the moment of a sale, money out first. So does it go to the investor? Is it just a 1x standard liquidation preference? So these are all things that are relevant, that go beyond just the valuation of your company, that can really affect and I've seen this go wrong in some cases, and founders just have a narrow mind about, what's the value of the company. And
do you have any examples of that loss of control, any cautionary tale for founders who are here or who may watch us on YouTube later?
Call out names here. Actually, on my flight this morning from San Francisco, I flew in from San Francisco last night, and on my flight there's a founder, an incredibly talented Brazilian founder from the Northeast. His name is André Ferraz, and he'll tell you about his journey as a founder. In the early days of his company, he basically lost control of the business. He wanted to pivot, change all kinds of things about his business, raise capital from new investors, and he got super stuck. And I remember I sat down with him several years ago, along with Florian from Lofton Canary, and I remember we kind of reworked the cap table, reworked the structure of the company, and helped him kind of untangle that. So the good news is that now he's reshaped the company. He was able to claw back some of the equity and retain more control of the business. So it's possible, but I can tell you it's very hard to fix. Once you go down a path as a founder, it's very hard. When you negotiate terms in a term sheet, if you give away certain terms, no new investor says, "Oh, I don't want those terms that the other investor negotiated." They say, "I want those terms and I want these new terms. And so you set a precedent as a founder, and so things can get quite tricky. I think I saw my lawyer in the audience a second ago here, so keeping things clean. But so that's one example. But that does happen, unfortunately. It happens less than years ago when investors were even more aggressive. I think today founders are a little more savvy and they have a better idea on how to negotiate. But if you've got a term sheet and you want some feedback on it, let me know.
So, there are the standard questions that VC will ask founders about. For instance, what are the milestones they plan to hit and when they plan to hit them? What is unique or proprietary about their product? But you mentioned, as we were talking before, sometimes founders overlook the psychology of VCs. So can you tell us a little bit more about the psychology of the VCs? What are, quote unquote, the intangibles of a founder that VCs are looking for?
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious things that you mentioned about, making sure that your customer acquisition costs are low and that your LTV is high and all those things that we all know, and cohort analysis. Those are all kind of startup 101 at this stage. I think on the intangibles, the psychology is real. Human emotion is a real thing. I'd say that there's a couple motivators for VCs. We've all heard of FOMO. Everyone knows what FOMO is. The other one is FOLS. So FOMO is the fear of missing out. FOLS, F-O-L-S, that's the fear of looking stupid. So investors are motivated by that also. So really understanding what motivates an investor, how they're going to be perceived with the investment. And I think the other thing to think about, and I remember talking about this with a founder at Latitude, and we were leading a session and we were talking with a handful of other founders. I think sometimes founders get wrapped up in the idea when they're kind of pitching their business. They try to communicate a reduction of risk. If you invest in me, there's a good chance that you're going to make money and things are going to work out. But the psychology of investors, an investor that has a portfolio of investments would rather have a founder tell them, look, this is going to be super hard. There's a good chance that it doesn't work. But if we do X, Y, Z, or we hit this, it's going to be enormous. Given that the dynamics of a venture fund is a hits business, when you try to minimize things and minimize the risk, it actually can have an adverse effect in the psychology of the investor. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind when you're pitching. But psychology is a big part of it as a founder. So you need to understand. Another
VCs are people too, right?
What's that?
VCs are people too.
Exactly. This is something we forget. There's the kind of the human emotion. I was talking with a founder, and I'm not going to call him out here, but he's got an incredible business, and he had trouble fundraising early on. And the reality is, I had to tell him, the feedback I gave him along with a few other people was he just wasn't being likable as a founder. VCs want to invest in people they actually like too. So that's an important part. They're going to be spending time with you. And so building a relationship with the investor, or with the investor, it's an important part of playing this kind of VC game.
Now, just as important, or perhaps even more important than the figures you get, is who you get from, right? Who is your investor, if it's the right fit? What should be founders looking for when trying to find that perfect match, trying to find the right investor for their businesses?
Well, first of all, if you're in a position where you have a choice, congratulations. Like that's not easy, right? For you to just be like, oh, I want to work with, X investor, Y investor. It's very difficult to get to that point where you have the leverage to be able to choose who you want. So sometimes money is okay, and that's, there's nothing wrong with just having an investor that will write you a check and, give you the capital you need to extend your runway or whatever, milestone. I actually wrote a blog post about how I made the decision when we raised our seed round. I was very systematic in how I evaluated this. What I did was I made a list of all the things that I care about as a founder. I wanted a global brand that could, I wanted an investor that kind of valued the aspect of community that we built at Latitude. So I made this I think it was 7 or 8 qualities and characteristics of a VC, and then actually stack rank them, and I assigned a multiplier to them. So, with the qualities that I look for, and then actually I met with all the VCs, and I told them that this is how I was deciding who I wanted to work with. So this obviously shifts a little of the power dynamic too, because it puts you in a position of you're choosing who your partner is. Not everyone has the luxury of doing that, but I think if you're intentional about what you want, it's easier to communicate to the investor and find the right investor. And I would also add that a lot of founders get obsessed with taking money from a big brand that's well known. The truth is, I would optimize more for the partner than the brand, because likely this investor is going to join your board, and if the brand is very well known, it's a great venture firm, it has a great reputation, it doesn't matter a whole lot if you don't like the person that's on your board or you don't feel like you connect with them. So I would optimize partner over brand and firm.
And access to capital across stages is not as abundant and as easy as it was a few years ago. So it may take more time for founders to raise capital between rounds. How do you think founders should navigate that scenario while aiming for the right scenario for them?
First of all, I want to just say that this is where I start showing my age and how long I've been doing this, because raising capital in 2009, very complicated, very difficult. Everyone is questioning why Brazil. So this is where I start kind of coming across with the old stories of walking to school in the snow. That's an American reference because it doesn't really snow much in Brazil. But the truth is, at this stage, where we are today, there's some tried principles that are just that everyone should be thinking about when you're raising capital. Obviously, at the early stage, things are a little bit different, but as you kind of scale up your capital raising, some very simple things to always remember. One, you want to raise capital when you don't need it. So you need to be going out, if you've raised capital and you've got some runway, you don't want to wait till 6 months, 9 months. You want to go out early enough. Another thing that we talk about at Latitude a lot is calendar density. So if you're going out to raise, let's say that you're fundraising here, and you've got a list of potential investors. First of all, it's not just like, oh, there's these 5 VCs I'm going to talk to. You should be making a very long list. You should be evaluating why they would be a good fit for what are you building a B2B business? Is it at Series A or a seed? And then you need to make a target list of investors that play in that space, kind of fitting with your investment thesis. And you need to do what we call calendar density. And that is where you line back-to-back-to-back meetings. So if you're raising and you're planning on over the next couple months to raise capital, you should lock in a 2-week period where you're meeting investors one after another. Why is this important? The reason why it's important is because as a founder, investors have a sixth sense. They can smell desperation. They're really good at understanding if you're kind of in dire need of capital, are you struggling? And so when you have meetings back to back, you send an aura to the investor. You're finishing the Zoom call exactly at 2:00. I'm sorry, I have a hard stop. I have another call after this. These are the intangible things that communicate to an investor. They're like, you're busy and you've got shit to do, and you're talking to other investors. So I wouldn't advise you to fake that, because investors are very good at also calling out bullshit. But there's a phrase that I like from the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. He said, if I have 7 hours to chop down a tree, I would spend 6 hours sharpening the axe so you can chop it down quickly. So the analogy there is prepare, analyze who you need to talk to, understand who's a good fit. Don't go pitching General Atlantic if you're a seed company. They invest $50 million checks. Find who the investors are that like your space, that like your geography, and then line them up and then see if you can get some capital in the door.
And talking about those relationships, and you mentioned a lot the need of trust between VCs and founders. Do you think that Latin American founders have to jump through more hoops than, say, American ones or European ones? And do you think that cultural differences play a big part in maybe raising tension in those relationships?
Look, I think that it's hard to generalize an entire region, let alone Brazil, that has multi-regions inside Brazil. I would say that if I were to compare with American founders, I think American founders tend to be more aggressive. You know, I was telling you earlier, you know, I consider myself quasi de América Latina, brasileiro, filho de brasileira, levo muitos anos aqui, voltando cada 3 meses aqui no Brasil. Então, eu acho que a diferença, às vezes, the difference sometimes is that American founders are just like, maybe over aggressive. They just, you know, they make a statement. I was giving an example is after spending many years in Colombia and Brazil, I went to Sand Hill Road. This is where all the venture capitalists in the Silicon Valley are. And I talked to a very well-known venture capitalist, and they asked me, they said, when are you going to take over, you know, your competitors? How long is it going to take you to be number one in Brazil? And I kind of like thought about it, and I was like, I think we can do it in like 2.5 years. And the reality is they wanted me to say 1 year. Because whatever you tell them, entrepreneurs are always overly optimistic. Whatever you tell them, they're going to give a haircut. They're going to, our numbers are going to be this. They're taking 20% less. And so sometimes founders in Latin America are too timid with their estimates or their, now I'm not encouraging you to inflate anything, but be bold in your, you know, obviously be bold and be grounded at the same time, but don't be afraid to be audacious with your statements and your what you're going to achieve, because most investors will probably take it at face value and then reduce, you know, 20% whatever you say. And so if you're already being realistic, 100% realistic, they're probably coming under that.
Well, Brian, I think we're running out of time. We could spend hours talking. Always a pleasure talking to you, and I hope I'll see you next year for another panel.
I'd love to come back. We have 20 seconds here, so I'm just going to say, cheguei hoje, Capim Santo, love the food. I always miss it. Faz falta quando estou na Califórnia a comida brasileira. Então, aproveitando o máximo.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, man. Let's take a picture real quick.
Yeah.